We left off in the last book coming to the realization that being a leftist is being a loser. Tale as old as time. You hate to see it. Aesthetics of Resistance, Volumes 2 and 3 now, by Peter Weiss. The narrator is fleeing the failure of the Spanish Civil War, where he served as an orderly to a doctor, never really even on the front lines. Being on the front lines is kind of a key thing to pay attention to in this trilogy. But the Spanish Civil War is, the sort of iconic leftist militant struggle that is equal parts valiant and tragic and humiliating. And the narrator is essentially on the run. He makes it to Paris first, but he is headed towards Sweden, where he'll kind of end up in this writers' colony co-op with Bertolt Brecht, of all people. I mentioned in the previous video the painting that the narrator and a bunch of his comrades were talking about, The Raft of the Medusa by Chapo, and he picks, right back up. They're still kind of continuing a lot of this dialogue around this painting. In this volume, he's talking a lot more about the history behind it, about how Chapo became very obsessed with death and with dead bodies, and he would, visit morgues and find himself way more at home kind of among the dead than the living. The Raft of the Medusa, of course, depicts basically a bunch of some survivors and a lot of non-survivors, a lot of dead bodies on a raft of a failed colonial expedition. And it's sort of the first, I think they're just catching sight of land is sort of the moment that it captures. And so it's this gruesome scene of death. The narrator is thinking about those that died. He centers the suffering, and it shows you kind of where his mind is. He immediately thinks about, the other people that have been washed away in the shipwreck of history, because that's where he is now. That is where most working and regular people have in fact been for all of history, both in the middle of the suffering, but also in the representation of that suffering have been generally pushed to the margins and to the side. There is no sufficient history of losing that the working people of this world have had to tell. Too often losing is our own private thing that we endure as a personal humiliation or failure or shame, which of course just ends up abstracting us away from the action needed to confront the system that is producing the shame and rigged losing, I might say, in the first place. We also start to hop out of the narrator a little bit. We get introduced to new characters. Some of them are historical characters. One of the other characters, I don't think she shows up in part one, if I'm remembered correctly, in volume one, but her name is Charlotte Bischoff, and this is a real life, underground communist cell worker that was one of the very few that I will go ahead and give a mild spoiler. She's one of the very few that ends up living at the end of it all. And one of the sort of unique characteristics about her is that she's very kind of ununique and unspectacular looking. Again and again, her looks are brought up as kind of being unremarkable, and her unremarkableness being this kind of, well, no one suspects. There's another conversation that another woman has with her of, you don't look like what I would expect a revolutionary to look like. And really interesting way to introduce this that I think was, fairly intentional by the author, is that you get so used to reading these block texts that you just assume that the narrator is kind of always there and present with you. Usually, a lot of the book is in fact framed where he's at the margin and he's observing, some more major figure. And in this section, you don't realize at first you're sort of disembodied from the narrator until you realize, oh no, I'm following a woman that's doing something somewhere completely different from the narrator. And then her name comes up, Charlotte. And I thought that was a really interesting way to kind of sneak in the unremarkableness of her looks, the sort of unsuspectingness of her very nature. She catches you by surprise. And I think that was, very intentional. It takes a couple pages before her actual name shows up. And it's sort of made clear, at least in my mind, that that we are, following a new character. You get some other scenes in which the narrator is not present. The last one in part 1 of volume 2 is between a Spanish communist leader named Gallego and a German guy named Stahlmann. And they are on a ship, I think, headed toward, or eventually they're headed toward the Soviet Union. And Gallego is talking about his escape from the Spanish Civil War. And it very intentionally recreates this kind of image of the raft of the Medusa, a story about him escaping an Algerian camp and making it to France in an extremely overcrowded ship, stuffed full of bodies. And I thought that was this really beautiful crescendo. There's often, it's a great crescendo to end part 1, and it's just really sort of spectacularly and very precisely done. We felt ourselves to be at the mercy of a politics that could not be influenced and that crushed all individual considerations. The nightmarishness of it resided in the fact that a seemingly unreal entity was claiming to be the sole representative of reality. What was really engulfing us at the moment was the renewed realization of how divorced we were from everything that made up the affairs of the state. We had become accustomed to accepting the deformities that were nothing but a reflection of our own insignificance and mental weakness. For context, this quote comes near the start of part 2, and the characters are talking through and struggling with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is, of course, when the Soviet Union and Germany signed basically a truce that they would carve up Poland, essentially, and that they would have a non-aggression pact. So this was seen as the ultimate capitulation to the actual fascist power. How could you not stand up to it? Of course, the reason behind this was a bit more realpolitik. The Americans essentially weren't in the war yet, and so without even the British were not that active, because this would have been 39, so it wouldn't have been till 40 until the British were, I think, really in the war. So they didn't have other allies, so they just decided, okay, let's make the truce with the Germans. So the main character arrives in Sweden at the house of Bertolt Brecht, where there's a kind of writing community / co-op / almost workshop. Literally, the main character compares it, because the main character is a factory worker himself, and has been able to find factory work, although on much more precarious grounds, in Sweden. He compares this factory work with the kind of almost like an assembly line type of way that Brecht has his workshop set up. The narrator is a researcher for one of Bertolt Brecht's plays called The Uprising, which is about a Swedish peasant uprising in about the 1450s, I believe, led by a guy named Engelbrekt Engelbrektsson, who himself is the owner of the mine. And, the narrator, of course, is connecting the ore that they're mining in medieval Sweden to the ore that the current Sweden is now, shipping off to the Nazi war effort as kind of part of their neutral compromise. Craft-wise, this is one of my favorite parts of the novel, because it really weaves and sort of intersperses both the kind of distant past and history of the Swedish uprising, of the medieval uprising with Engelbrektsson, but then it also draws out parallels to the recent past in Sweden with the revolutionary workers movement kind of post-World War I. And there is a manner in which one movement sort of prefigures the other, because in the medieval Swedish case, there's another, essentially after the initial uprising and after they get their demands met, the movement is suborned or overtaken by a different Swedish noble, who eventually ends up becoming the king of Sweden himself. And so in the way that movement is co-opted, the characters also draw out how the movement of, sort of full-blown communism at least as it was tried in Sweden, has been co-opted by the Social Democrat Party, where is still sort of a bourgeois capital party. It's still a party that is focused on reform as opposed to revolution. Shut up! And as some color in the background, you're getting a very harried Bertolt Brecht, who is constantly having, conversations about both kind of his artistic production as well as the political situation. And then he's getting essentially forced to evacuate, forced to flee, ejected out of Sweden. And he's going to go first to Finland, and then eventually in history he escapes to America. One of the things that has really struck with me about that book is how so much of the artistic production by the characters in the present, of the novel at least, so much of the artistic production is framed as a collaborative production, as a collaborative effort. Like this with the Bertolt Brecht stuff, he's having numerous people kind of do deep research onto these things, and then he's having conversations with them and talking about how it relates to the current political situation, et cetera, et cetera. But even when the narrator takes up this project, the narrator takes it up in kind of literal conversation with another one of the writers there, one of the researchers there. And then you can also look at the way in which, I know it's not strictly art, but the way in which the propaganda, what the main character is going to end up doing is start working for the Inner Front, which is both an internal and external for those, obviously, the narrators in exile. But it's a propaganda network and sort of also a spy network, sponsored by or aided in great part by the Soviet Union. And so that, of course, is all a very collective and collaborative effort. And the narrator, I think, might do some writing for the Inner Front, but I think he's mostly just like a messenger boy, a glorified messenger boy. I think very intentionally Weiss is, avoiding this idea of the sort of lone genius author, connecting it to, like any work in society, it's collaborative. It's done collectively as it's produced, and art being this sort of mutual cooperation comes out very loud and clear in this series and in this section in particular. In late May of 1939, my parents had managed to reach the so-called Tri-Point, where the borders of Silesia, the Czech territories, and Poland met. They didn't have any luggage with them. Just the advance that my father had received in Polish currency, which was sewn into the seam of his jacket. Amid the chaotic movement in which they found themselves, another superior force was perceptible. One that shook nerves and tendons, that pushed them forward and swept them away with it. Meticulously calculated force that proceeded according to set plans. And while the refugees clung to the notion that borders could still be crossed, countries traversed, destinations reached, the paths and roads they were taking were funneling them toward a machinery that aimed to divide them up, separate them from one another, and count them before consigning them to be liquidated. Some slowly, some quickly. And once again, at the start of a book in this series, we find ourselves in hell. Like I said, history of leftism is the history of losing. The historical nightmare that we find ourselves waking up to is the journey that the mother has gone on to reunite with her son. Both the mother and the father have reunited with their son in Sweden now, and then the son gives us kind of the horrifying story that the mother has had to go through, including being a prisoner of a concentration camp. And as a result of this, she comes out completely catatonic and withdrawn from the world. This is the anchoring event of part one. The mother is completely zombified, almost guilty for her existence, guilty for her survival, a ghost that has not yet departed from this earth. Meanwhile, the men, especially the father, is sort of told by the doctor to really perform almost an excitement for life, a zest for life amidst this just horrible cascade of, frankly, the world ending and the painful new world being born. The mother's catatonia is paired with the tragedy of another character, a girl, a woman about the age of the narrator, who I believe is also German, but comes from a more upper class background than the narrator, this woman gives a lot more voice to the despair, and to the, I think especially to the despair from the female perspective. And this book pairs both the horrible and awful violence that is visited upon, again, kind of the working people of the world, especially the working women of the world. And it's kind of right next to all of the very almost workaday humdrum existence of what the narrator's doing. Because, like, the narrator is, like I said, kind of a glorified messenger boy for this, propaganda outlet in exile. He's, connected with the cells back in Berlin, but, distantly. And a lot of what he personally is having to just abide through is kind of the tedious day by day existence of just his immediate surroundings. The unglamorousness of the work of the revolution is often centered in this book, whether it's being an orderly for a doctor in Spain in the Spanish Civil War, or whether it's being just another delivery node for an exiled German newspaper. In part one of this novel, we do get a couple more Charlotte Bischoff scenes. We sort of follow her into Berlin and into the underground structures when we get to part two. And again, they are running this kind of, it's Soviet sponsored, but it's very much undertaken by the German communists themselves. And it's kind of a propaganda, kind of a spy informational network. The most powerful scene of this part is no doubt the execution scenes at what I believe is called Plötzensee prison. They are very well managed, but not belabored. It's quite a few people who are executed, but it is still grotesque. Its specificity reminded me to kind of bring it back to epic poetry, like I mentioned in my first video. It sort of rhymed with like the Iliad's way of describing the specificity of death. And again, that's the other side that's featured. There's the sort of humdrum, quotidian, almost tedious existence, and then there is the violence that is the violence and the death that is visited upon, the working people of the world. One of the strange things about Volume 3 is that, in fact, there's not a lot of aesthetics. It's mostly resistance at this point. There's so like little talk, I feel like, of specific like artworks, that there's this one sort of almost to the side in the margins throw off scene in the middle of when you're kind of almost getting introduced to everyone in Berlin. There's like an offhand comment. I forget exactly even what they're debating. Maybe it's like philosophy, and it's not even, like art or sculpture, like they were exploring in the first two volumes. But it's such like a throwaway line that you're like, oh yeah, this is the aesthetics of resistance. But by that final part, it's all about resistance at that point, buddy. The pace really does pick up in this last part because, of course, the execution scene actually takes place in 1942, and somewhere in the middle of part 2 of volume 3, and then you got to get through the next 3 years of the war. And so the main character and his communists' kind of last hope throughout all this is that somehow there will be like a communist uprising in Germany that will be able to take over the state before either the Soviets get there or the Americans get there. I was also reminded by a couple of the passages in this book that this was written from like a moment of historical agony. Both, like, there was a historical agony obviously in World War II, but also in 1980, when I think the final volume was originally published. Also, the actual author is dying, and so he is dying, and Germany has sort of been, in his life, kind of forever cleft in two. And there's a lot of, not a lot, but there's definitely a passage in there that made you really think like, oh, this, like, there was something like broken and tragic about, because at this point, like, Germany had really failed to cohere into a nation, like, for most of its history, because they only became the empire in the 1870s, blew up kind of after World War II, became the Nazis, and then, throughout the Cold War, they're two different nations. And so it's a moment in which both like communist possibilities seem extinguished, but also just German like national possibilities seem to be extinguished. And, I have no idea. I doubt that Weiss would have expected that had he just hung on for 10 more years, he would have seen a reunited Germany. But history turns quick, as we're learning now in this day and age. The thing that has stuck with me most about this book was what the final volume drove home so hard. That contrast between the seemingly invisible push to the margins, workaday work that working people do, and the gruesome slaughter that comes to visit them. That is, of course, ringing very loudly in my ear right now as we see the brutal executions of Renee Good and Alex Pretty in Minnesota, or as we see the measles outbreaks in the so-called detention camps, where there have been a record number of deaths of people in ICE custody. All of that sort of gruesome violence that is happening today. Also, the millions of people that are dying without USAID across the world, presumed to be probably 10 to 12 million by the end of 2030. All of that contrasted with like my little humble efforts to, get organized politically with my local politics chapter, let's say, for the first time in my life. That, like, I'm feeling that sort of two sides of the coin very heavily right now. My humdrum life contrasted with the reaping that has only barely begun to surface.
Crimes both here in the U.S. and against people in Venezuela.
Immediately after the interview finished, Plichta was arrested by two Grand Rapids police officers. Tells Plichta that she is being arrested for obstructing a roadway and failure to obey a lawful command.
I'm a United States citizen!
And the question that this book asks of you as you read it as a citizen in the Imperial Corps in the midst of its own democratic backslide is, do you have the horses? Do you have the horses to take all of the losing that this moment is going to require before it even gets a little bit better? Do you have the horses to grind it out against your own government while bodies in misfortune pile up around you?
They're all just these neurotic rosaries that we go through about like, well, what should we do? Like hypothetically, as if we have the power to do anything. As if our opinion on like whether they should stack the court matters. As if that could possibly matter. You can only really participate as an observer or even a participant in arguments about abstract things that you can't answer. Because there's nobody there who can stack the court. At every level, that doesn't exist. So you have to ask yourself, well, what am I going to do? What am I going to contribute to? The level of like life. And the fact is, if you're going to confront this thing, if we're going to confront this thing, at some point, we're going to be able to, like, actually challenge, and they're going to raise. As we said, they're never going to fold, they're going to raise. And that means conditions are going to change, things are going to get more dangerous, much less abstract. And then you're going to have to do something. And the question you have to ask yourself is, do you have the horses for it? Not argue about whether you should do it now. Let's just assume we're going to do it because you want to do it. I'm not going to argue that I know your life better than you. I'll take it. Do what you want to do. But do you fucking have the horses for it?
It's an accounting of like, what do we have in our arsenal? Who do we have? Like, we have to start thinking about like, what we's do we actually have?